roads there. For instance, there hadn't been as many washouts on the roads and in the fields. And what they were noticing was the fruits of decades of work by a farmer-driven group that, despite the many barriers that they had encountered over the several decades that they'd been in operation, I don't want people to get into all of the barriers they did encounter, they were carrying out watershed management and small-scale water storage, while the rest of the Manitoban farming community continued with the status quo of draining the water off the land as quickly as possible. So they were located in the South Tobacco Creek watershed, which is southwest of Winnipeg. It's about 75 kilometers square, and here it is in the map in red. So what did they do? Well, first of all, they built a series of 26 small dams, and they were of 3 different types. I won't go into detail on all of them, but some of them slowed down the water for just a short time, holding it back for a few hours to a few days, just reducing peak flows on the rivers. Others held it on the land for a longer period of time to allow the water to be used as a sort of reservoir for livestock and irrigation. And they also created shelter belts. They had gully stabilization, because South Tobacco Creek is actually one of the places in Manitoba where you do get hills. I'm from Winnipeg, and it's pretty flat there, but it's actually pretty hilly out here because it's on the Manitoba Escarpment. And grass waterways, among other beneficial management practices. And this is a conceptual model in terms of resilience in watersheds that shows what holding water back on the landscape can do in terms of floods and droughts. The precipitating factor for the development of the changes in South Tobacco Creek was the disasters, and this is a conceptual model of how watershed management can buffer against flooding and drought. So when you hold water back on the land, the peak of the flood is lower, and then this water enters the system more slowly, and then, if you find yourself in a drought year, as you see in the second half of the graph, you might be quite grateful for the stored water, because then you can use it to increase your own resilience. And I originally created this graph to talk about how wetlands can provide buffering against floods and droughts, but it lends itself quite nicely to talking about South Tobacco Creek as well, where the dams store the water rather than the wetlands. So you can have sort of ecological infrastructure that's storing the water, or you can have man-made infrastructure. So, on the theoretical end of things, and this is Cynthia Neudorfer's work, she wasn't able to be here, but this is some findings from her PhD thesis, and she looked at South Tobacco Creek for it. And I like to focus on how South Tobacco Creek demonstrates Holling's adaptive cycle of resilience, the figure 8 diagram that Martin was talking about. And I'm going to walk you through how South Tobacco Creek got to where they are and the different cycles that they went through to become more resilient. So, oops, that's supposed to, how do I go back? Okay, pretend I'm down here, okay? Back in the 1970s, they were similar to other farming communities in Manitoba, where the dominant sentiment was, get this water off of my land as quickly as possible. Because Manitoba it's a wet landscape. When the European explorers first came, they basically, the map they made, they just put the word swamp in many different areas. We really are wet, and we drain an awful lot of water off of it, wetlands and water in the spring, and we really made a practice of draining the water. And then the South Tobacco Creek experienced a particularly unpleasant spring flood in 1979, and they'd also seen many floods before that. The 1960s were labeled as the wet decade. So their vulnerability had become fairly apparent. And then in the early 1980s, they ended up in a drought, which made the possibility of a new approach even more attractive. And they had developed high levels of local knowledge that they were rather exposed to these disasters. So by 1982 or so, they figured that they had enough of this vulnerability, and they formed an informal farmers group to look at what was going on and what the heck they could do about it. They knew that they were vulnerable, they wanted to increase their resilience, and they knew that the way to get there was to work together. So in a nod to complexity, I should also note there were other factors at this time other than the flooding. There were high interest rates, low grain prices, and increasing awareness at different scales, municipal, provincial, and federal, that flooding and erosion were a problem. So there were a lot of different, Margaret, would you call these driving forces or not? Pressing them to, okay, she says yes, I can. Okay, I think we're there. The group formalized into the Deerwood Soil and Water Management Association in 1985. Prior to that, it was kind of an informal farmer group talking about, well, what can we do? And by this time, the sentiment was changing from, let's get this water off the land, to let's hold the land, or hold the water on the land for the greater good. So that's a big shift in thinking. And what was this greater good? Well, resilience was actually a big part of it. Let's make our watershed more resilient. And this marked the move to a new cycle when they got funding through an economic and regional development agreement, because funding to actually do some actions rather than talk about it on the ground elevated this to a new level. So I'm not sure how Martin would term that. One attractor to another. Was money an attractor there?
Money is not an attractor itself, but it could be part of factors.
Okay.
Funder could be another actor or component of the system.
Yeah, but they were able to shift or reorganize towards a new cycle in building socio-ecological resilience. And they built the dams that I mentioned before and implemented the other beneficial management practices until they hit a crisis. Their funding was to be cut. But they had built resilience, and they had strong social capital, good connections. They worked with 20 different organizations across Manitoba approximately, and they had so much determination that they built up. They improved their resilience, and with the help of their networks, they found new funding sources. And from what I've heard, this was actually quite discouraging at the time, but they had the resolution to press on. And with the help of their cross-scale partners, they managed to transition from the Deerwood Association to the South Tobacco Creek project. And by 2002, they had acquired funding from the federal program for watershed evaluation of beneficial management practices, which helped them to transition seamlessly from one source of funding to another. And they also recently acquired funding from the Canadian Water Network to study the cumulative effect of their actions. For instance, how the actions they were taking was reducing phosphorus in the water. And that's also a demonstration of resilience. So they anticipated that their funding from WEBS was going to run out. I think it runs out in 2013, so they knew they needed a new funding source. They anticipated that, they organized, and Cynthia's work indicates that this is the thing to transition to a new cycle. And I'm going to shift gears a little bit here. The South Tobacco Creek group has made itself resilient in numerous ways. They are economically more resilient since their farming system is less vulnerable to the effects of floods and droughts. Socially, I say they're more resilient just because they have such strong social capital built up between the farmers and with different organizations within Manitoba. And by reinventing themselves again and again, they've proven themselves to be resilient on a social and organizational level. And they're buffered against floods and droughts, as I mentioned. Now this matters for farmers, obviously, but I'd also like to touch on some findings from a literature review that I did recently on the health effects of floods and droughts more broadly, and how watershed management can help mitigate these effects and make us more resilient from a health perspective. So this is going outside of farming to the more general population and from a public health perspective. The first 2 points are pretty straightforward. Droughts caused the most deaths in the 20th century than any other disaster. This is on a global scale. And guess what came in second? Floods. And on to the second point, in floods, you can get a variety of injuries and illnesses ranging from being damaged by debris in the floodwaters to being exposed to molds. Diseases can increase from flooding, particularly in a Canadian context. Heavy rains in Ontario contributed to carry contaminants into the water system during Walkerton, so flooding of the sort contributed there. Floods can also lead to more standing water and provide habitat for vector-borne diseases, such as West Nile virus mosquitoes. And since floods affect animal life as well, we can see rodents being driven to human populations and carrying with them the likes of hantavirus. So the range of diseases when you move into the developing world and have risks of things like cholera, malaria, and typhoid are even greater. And we're seeing the effect of drought on food security right now in the US Corn Belt and elsewhere. And then there's the likelihood that food prices will be on the increase for everyone. And my second point there, the psychological health effects of floods and droughts are quite interesting to me because they're rather actually understudied and overlooked in much of the literature. We tend to focus on the immediate costs of floods, on infrastructure, and on farm outputs. But I have a quote up there that I really like, is that the common perception is that once the floodwaters have receded, the crisis is over. But in reality, that's when some people, that health effects just, they begin to start on them as they look at what's happened. And then I also looked at the linkages to social determinants of health. For instance, some lower income people might live in more flood prone areas. There's research in terms of older people might be more resilient to flooding or to disasters in general because they've experienced them in the past. So I guess what I'm trying to illustrate here is that watershed management, if you reduce the chances of floods and droughts, you might also be buffering yourself against different types of health effects that I've outlined here. And these are documented separately in the literature, but they aren't necessarily linked to watershed management, so that's what I was trying to do in my literature review. And we covered quite a bit in that short period of time, which was hopefully about 20 minutes. I guess, well, there's another presentation up, so I guess questions are for later, or?